I call Matt Ducey.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a great pleasure and an honour to rise and speak in support of a very important bill. It was disappointing. The only relevance in that last member's speech about the bill was when he got the title correct. Everything after that completely had no relevance whatsoever. So I'll attempt to go a bit further. I'll mention the title, the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf, Environmental Effects, Transitional Provisions, Amendment Bill, third reading. Mr Speaker, this bill is about business continuity. It's about a government who cares, who believes in New Zealand, believes in a productive economy as well as protecting in the environment. And that's why last September, Mr Speaker, New Zealanders backed us. They supported us because they trust us. They know we are responsible, Mr Speaker. And today, the guilt and the envy is palpable in the House, Mr Speaker. Can I first acknowledge the Honourable Dr Nick Smith for his work in this area, as well as the Chair of the Local Government and Environment Select Committee, Scott Simpson. Mr Speaker, the guilt and the envy is palpable. The guilt from a Labour Party who over 9 years did absolutely nothing in this space, and the embarrassment that causes them, Mr Speaker. And for the Greens, the envy and resentment that we are delivering what they wanted to deliver. For them, it's like the player that gets subbed off halfway through a game resenting they never really performed at any sort of level. For the Greens, it's been like the water boy, always been looked over for selection, but holding on that one day they'll get the nod. Mr Speaker, the guilt, the embarrassment, the envy and the resentment. Mr Speaker, there's a lot happening in the environmental space with this government, in the blue-green space, but it was great to see this legislation go through the legislative process. From the first reading, where there was some concerns, conspiracy stories, but the way this bill was managed through the select committee process, where we heard around 5 submissions, who each of them had very valid points that the select committee had to think through. There was very collegial discussions, and in the end this legislation was amended through the second reading, and now we have this final reading. Mr Speaker, we're talking about a sector where there's very real consequences. We do know from the regulatory impact statement that if Shell Todd Oil in the Maui field was to cease, it would have significant impact on New Zealand's economy. But not only the economy, Mr Speaker, we're talking about New Zealand's well-being. And what we do know is that the Maui field produces about 26% of New Zealand's gas supply and is a big employer in the Taranaki region, employing about 300 people. So it's right that this government is working to protect a valuable sector to the New Zealand economy and a valuable employer. We do know in this case we have the old Pareto ratio, 80-20. And this field, Mr Speaker, produces around 80% of the gas consumed and provides for about 20% of sites, petrochemical sites, electricity generation, as well as large industrial users in our export economy. And we do know, Mr Speaker, as New Zealanders, it's the export economy which drives this country forward and improves the well-being of all New Zealanders. The regulatory impact statement, Mr Speaker, also outlined that a previous outage in 2011 cost the economy $200 million. That was $40 million a day, Mr Speaker. So we do know it's right to not only grow the economy, but protect our environment. And that's this national government's approach, Mr Speaker, the blue-green approach. And I don't see it more in my electorate of Waimakariri, where the residents and the constituents in Waimakariri understand this, Mr Speaker. A great area of primary production that produces a lot of export goods. And we know it's about improving the quality of the water storage, and to increase productivity of the land. So it's great to see this government delivering in this space. Mr. Speaker, there was a key part of this bill around the specified timeframes for applying for shell tod oil for marine consent. And what this committee did, quite rightly, is work through those issues. There was a proposal for 6 months, would have put it in line with the EEZ Act, the Crown Minerals Act and the RMA Act. 6 months looked pretty credible. There was also 9 months and 12 months. 12 months did seem a long time, but why this committee settled on 9 months was because of the 140 statutory days for this application process, as well as time for appeals and objections. So this committee did settle on the 9 months. And why it's right that we have time for not only appeals and objections to take place. Some of the submitters, Mr. Speaker, were concerned that this might allow an open-ended process to the application process. But that is only right because every New Zealander expects to be heard. They want to be part of this process. And it is only a country like New Zealand that allows every New Zealander the right of submitting and orally presenting to their submission. So if that takes time, then so be it. And it's great that everyone will have the time to make a submission during this process. So it was great to see the legislative process work its way through as the committee decided between 6, 9 and 12 months. Mr. Speaker, we had a submission from Frack Free, Kapiti and Beyond, and they were very concerned about the open-ended process that I've just talked about. So it's great to see that submitters can be involved. A key part of this, Mr. Speaker, was section 162, clause 4, and around the inflexibility of this clause and this section. So what we wanted to do is to make it flexible, to allow these petroleum companies to fit into this new regime and continue operating when their previous permit had expired. And I think that is right because for these large petroleum operators, they needed business certainty and they needed business continuity. And you would ask any small, medium or large business throughout New Zealand, and it's all around business continuity. Even the farmers and my electorate, Mr. Speaker, measure themselves around reliability of water to feed the stock and produce what they can. So it's quite right that we're supporting, with this piece of legislation, business continuity. Can I also highlight, Mr. Speaker, that I think the submitters in this bill got it right. They were very concerned that this petroleum operator, they knew about it, they didn't get their act together, and they should have provided more information up front. And I think for most New Zealanders, they're pretty astute, and it's very hard to argue against that. So when we heard submissions from Pepans, which was representing the petroleum operators and other individuals and private sector, I would urge them to be involved in this process a lot earlier. Now there is clear timelines and expectations to be a bit more interventionist with petroleum companies to ensure that they get these applications in on time. Mr. Speaker, I wrote down a bit of a checklist in my first reading, and I think it's still very relevant. I had a look at it. It says, does this bill support our fourth biggest export commodity earner? Yes. Does this bill avoid the closure of a gas field at $40 million a day? Yes. Does this bill protect 300 jobs? Yes. Does this bill support existing operators to transition into the Exclusive Economic Zone Act? Yes. Does this bill protect $800 million worth of taxes and royalties from operators in the sector which pays for public services such as schools, hospitals and roads? Yes. And very much for the Greens, does this bill support the retiring of coal mining by supporting gas exploration and exporting? Yes, Mr. Speaker. So very much like myself and Ron Mark, This bill was small, simple, but yet very effective, and I support it to the House, Mr Speaker.
I call Gareth Hughes.